Hello, we're back and we have one last video lecture for you on legal aspects in HIM. This one will get into some finer points about patient rights, release of information, and workplace with HIM issues. And we also have some special legislation and regulations on lab results. The Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments Act of 1988 allows labs to give patients or their designee access to a patient's completed test reports on the patient or the patient's personal representative's request. Now, patients can continue to access lab results from their provider's office or get the results directly from the lab that performed the test. Covering prohibition of redisclosure. When copies of PHI are appropriately released to another provider, that provider is prohibited from redisclosing them unless they're authorized to do so. And this is especially important with mental health, HIV, substance abuse treatment records, and what have you. The Drug Abuse Treatment Act of 1972 requires that a notice accompanies each disclosure of PHI. The HIPAA final privacy rule requires that patient authorization to disclose PHI contains a general statement. Now, important thing to bear in mind, a provider is allowed to redisclose PHI created by another party if the disclosure is for a purpose that's already permitted by the privacy rule. For example, patient care, treatment, if you will. When releasing copies of PHI from the patient's medical record, you need to include a cover sheet that includes a statement about the prohibition of redisclosure unless it's explicitly authorized. Now we get into disclosure accounting. Health information departments maintain a release of information log that documents each time a patient's information released to any authorized requester. Each covered entity must establish a tracking mechanism and reporting process that includes the following: the date of the disclosure, the name and the address of the entity and the person who received the PHI, the description of the PHI that was disclosed, and the reason of why it was disclosed. And a patient has a right to receive an accounting of all disclosures of PHI made by a covered entity during the 6 years prior to the date that an accounting was requested, except for specific disclosures. When an individual requests an accounting, the covered entity has 60 days to act on the request, and one 30-day extension is allowed. Covered entity should select a method for tracking disclosures that'll work best for them. This could be computerized tracking, manual PHI disclosure record. It's up to the facility. The important thing is they need to have a method of tracking it. Covered entities must provide individuals with one free accounting during any 12-month period. And the covered entity must inform an individual of any required fee and allow the individual an opportunity to amend their request to avoid or reduce the fee. Now we get into the workplace, and this gets a little bit more complicated. Let's start on the left-hand side. An employee is an individual that's hired by a business to work either for a salary or for wages. When we use the term at will employment, an employee can leave anytime and the employer can terminate the employee at any time. Unions establish agreements with the employers, and these are upheld by the union members, right? So even this is a difference between unionized employees and at will employees. right? Having a union represent a group of employees adds a third party to the employer-employee relationship. Independent contractors are not employees. They're individuals with a contractual relationship with an organization, and they're paid at a specific rate. Could be per diem, could be per hour, what have you. And the contracts are established that specify the scope of work and how they're to be paid. There are a lot of new regulations, particularly from the tax end, about when somebody can be considered an independent contractor, a 1099 employee, as sometimes people refer to them as. We also have temporary employees, and these are employees who work for a service, and that service basically leases them to do certain things, like code medical records, for instance. There are coding companies that do that. And there are many laws that pertain to employers, employees, contractors, and temporary employees during federal acts. And these are covered in the management course, but some of the ones you're probably already familiar with include the Age Discrimination Employment Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Family Medical Leave Act. Laws that govern discrimination cover any protected group, protected in terms of age, sex, racial, religious, disability, national origin, and other areas protected by law. As an HIM professional, you're going to be getting more involved in these laws during your hiring by an organization. That's all I have for you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you online. Bye now.